What's going on, guys? AA Ron here. Today I've got a little garage remodel action. The goal here was to make the space multifunctional. I wanted to be able to quickly transition between shop mode and car shelter mode. To do that, I primarily needed to keep the cabinet shallow, build a folding work surface, and move the kayaks to the ceiling. Also, all large power tools needed to be wheel mounted. The first step was throwing some epoxy down on the floor. I'm using Sherwin-Williams tile-clad high solids, and of course before I got going on this video I did the whole acid etch prep. It's an industrial maintenance product that was recommended to me by an installer back when I lived in Phoenix. I applied it at my old house and it lasted 5 years without issue, so I was happy to use it again. As far as color goes, I went with something of a cement tone, primarily because if it were to chip here or there, it wouldn't be as noticeable. Speaking of color, I went with chips from originalcolorchips.com. I'm a fan of this website because one can make their own custom color blend and have it shipped in relatively small quantities. They also have hundreds of colors, so you can get pretty creative. They even have things like glow-in-the-dark, fluorescent, or metallic flakes. For my top coat, I'm using another OCC product, HPU 747. It's a catalyzed polyurethane that's placed the day after epoxy. If you've ever used a product like this, make sure you've got some wide open doors and a good organic vapor respirator because it and similar products have crazy levels of VOCs. When it came time to coat the walls, I went with dark gray on the bottom, a red accent stripe, and white on top. To paint that stripe, I'm making use of my laser level, a pretty invaluable tool for painting. It throws a nice level line out across the entire room so we can just tape along that. It's a lot quicker and more accurate than using a tape measure and beam level to mark lines. Only downside is the room needs to be semi-dark as the laser isn't all that bright and can easily be washed out by sunlight. After taping, here's a little trick I picked up a while back. Go ahead and run a quick bead of base colored paint on top of your paint. This seals all the little divots and recesses underneath, so no more top coats bleeding underneath your tape. The result is a razor sharp line when removed. As anyone who's ever painted with vibrant colors knows, it's a multi-coat process. This particular red needs about 5 coats to completely cover. However, when complete, and because we ran that quick bead of base color over the tape, we get some really clean lines. Getting my kayaks on the ceiling required some hoists from Amazon. I'll link below. I needed to span several joists, so I first mounted a 2x4 and then mounted the brackets to that. It's a pretty clever system. Rigging for the bow and stern are handled independently via parallel pulleys. Then an automatic braking system holds the ropes prior to tying them off to a wall-mounted cleat. To keep things a comfortable working temperature during the kind of cold Seattle winters, I'm using a 4800 watt 240 volt garage heater, also from Amazon. Moving on to the most labor intensive portion of this build, and we've got some cabinets to fabricate. I'll start with ripping some plywood to 16 inches on my table saw. Next, the foundation stem wall extends about 1.5 inches beyond the finished drywall, so I'll need to notch out the bottom 20 inches to make room. Holes for the shelves are drilled using a template from Milescraft. This is one of those items that could be home fabricated, but at only a $20 purchase price, I feel like it's worth the purchase just to save the time. To fasten the uppers and lowers, I'll go ahead and use my favorite all-around quick and easy joinery method, the pocket screw. It's certainly not the prettiest or strongest way to put two pieces of wood together, but it is the fastest. If you've ever used pocket screws, you'll know what I'm doing here. Basically, when tightening, the joint tends to move a bit, so I'm using a C-clamp as a stop to keep the bottom flush with the side while driving the fastener into place. Next, I'm going to install some top and center braces. I don't know why I didn't just use a solid piece for the entire back of the cabinet. Because I got cheap and lazy, the wall will remain exposed inside. I wish I didn't do it this way, but oh well. As far as the face frame goes, I'm first fabricating as a whole piece and then attaching it to the body, again with more pocket screws. I'm intentionally oversizing by about 1/16 on the top, bottom, and sides to leave a little bit of room for the flush trim bit to clean things up. After that, it's time to finish off with a little sanding. The cabinet grade plywood and prime pine face frame are already in pretty good shape, but still I wanted to take it to 150 grit and use this opportunity to soften the sharp edges as well. Installation is on deck and is probably, next to removing painting tape, one of the most satisfying things you can do. It's just one big chunk of the project coming together. Prior to sliding in place, I marked the locations of all studs and will be hitting those. Per standard cabinet installation procedures, I'll also be securing each cabinet to its neighbor via the face frame. To make the cabinet shelves, I'm using some 3/4 inch sanded pine plywood that my neighbor was going to throw out to make a little production line here, and because all of the cabinets are identically sized, I'll make everything at once. I always think that's a good habit that any efficient DIYer should get into, really planning out their steps and batching things as much as possible. It really helps with time efficiency. Then to edge band, I'm going to rip some 3/4 inch stock to 1 inch wide, attached to the plywood, once again employing the pocket screw, nature's most versatile fastener. To make the door frames, I'll start by ripping these low quality pine boards into narrower, low quality pine boards. Truth being told, I'd kind of blown the budget on this project and had to remind myself it's just a garage. So the downgrade from prime to select was valid in my book. Besides, once everything's ripped, sanded, machined, and painted, it all kind of looks the same. After that, it was over to the miter saw with a stop block setup. I cut all the rails and stiles to length in one batch, again saving a bunch of time as every door was to be the exact same size. Back at the table saw, and it's time to cut the rails using my dado stack. I'll be using a sacrificial fence for this operation. And by the way, if you're just getting into the makerspace, I really can't overestimate or overstate the usefulness of the table saw. I feel like it's the one tool that I genuinely could not do without. You use it for everything: cross-cutting, ripping, dadoing, dimensioning, literally everything. You can even make jigs for it to do things like jointing. After the stiles, it's time to slot the rails. Nothing fancy here, just get your dado width set and go to town. Then finally, if you've done everything right, you'll slot the rails, and hopefully that should match the tongue exactly. Over on the router table, and I've got a simple roundover bit set up to just take the sharp edges off the recently machined wood. In preparation for installing hinges, I'll employ my Wen 4214 drill press and a Forstner bit to make some flat bottomed holes. For the door panels, I'll be using some 1/4 inch cabinet grade plywood painted with Rust-Oleum metallic aluminum. I thought it would provide something of an industrial look to the finished product and would nicely contrast with the satin black frames. While those were taking some time to dry, I went ahead and repurposed my old pegboard. The new location only allowed me something with a 24-inch height, so I just cut it down on, you guessed it, the table saw again. Prior to painting it with that same metallic used on the door panels, I just needed to cut out a spot for the outlet behind it. In retrospect, I should have cut out a hole just big enough for an electrical box extender and then flush mounted the receptacle to the pegboard. Moving on, and installing the hinges was once again done on a production line. 15 doors times 2 hinges each meant 15 of them needed to be installed. At this quantity, make sure to buy them online, as they end up being about $1.50 each from Amazon, as opposed to $5 each if purchased from the big overpriced orange box that I love to hate. I decided to go chrome on the handles for its durability, and because I thought it would match the metallic aluminum panels well. To install, I made a little template with some scrap wood and pre-drilled all the doors at once. This ended up being much quicker than trying to individually measure. For my workbench, and I use that term very loosely because it's actually just a folding temporary shelf, I'm going with solid maple I picked up at the local hardwood supplier. After ripping some straight edges on the table saw, I'm going to join the two boards using my biscuit joiner. This is one of those tools that does one thing very well. It's not very versatile, but it's perfect for its single job. I then went ahead and trimmed off a little excess off of one board. I'm not worried about perfection here, as I'll be retrimming after I glue on some strips to build up the edge thickness. I'm going to use my belt sander to smooth the top. I've got a love-hate relationship with this tool. It takes stock down quickly, but hit it at the wrong angle and you can gouge it just as fast. To build up edges, I'm gluing on some 1-inch strips that were left over from when I ripped the maple boards to width. Again, I left a small overhang so I could use my flush trim bit on the router to get everything to the correct size. To put a little radius on the corners, I'm using a router template from Rockler. After using a pattern bit on top, I flip the table over and again use the flush trim bit to match the radius. After filling in any gaps or holes and doing some finish sanding, I'm coating with a little special sauce. Basically just black Rust-Oleum cut 1-to-1 with mineral spirits. I wanted to darken the wood but still leave some of that nice maple grain visible. Shelf mounting was accomplished with a pair of locking braces purchased on Amazon. They claim they're good for 440 pounds, but I don't think I'd push them nearly that far. Truth being told, I don't ever use my workbench as a workbench. I just kind of use it as a temporary folding shelf, so this should work well and will allow it to fold down in the future, leaving space to back the cars in. And that was pretty much the last thing I needed to do. From there was just a big cleanup effort and an attempt to find a home for everything. I always like this part of the project. It's like the symbolic end. Like when you get to this stage, you know you're done and can move on, so it's pretty satisfying. But before I can really put a bow on this one, I need to see if my cars will fit in and if all those measurements I had been taking all along actually were correct. So it's the moment of truth. They do. And that's the end.